Thanks for joining us today. My name is 𝗦𝗲𝘀𝘀𝗀𝗃𝗃. I'm a solutions architect here with Eon. And today we're going to talk about Eon's next generation cloud backup posture management platform and how we're helping Azure customers move faster in the cloud and make sure that their workloads are protected. So Eon is really all about making sure that we're providing an actual cloud native backup approach that not just makes backups more efficient, but makes them more usable. So let's look at some of the issues that we've seen our customers note with backup solutions in the cloud today. So obviously at Eon, right, our team, both from our founders down to our engineering team, sales and solutions architecture teams, kind of come from a data protection and disaster recovery background. And so over the last several years, right, we've noted a lot of different pain points that our customers have seen when it comes to protecting data in the cloud. So let's go over some of those, right? One major one is that backup data, when we're talking about cloud backups, is largely inaccessible, right? It kind of sits there as a snapshot on the shelf, right, to maybe be used one day. And that can be a costly liability, right? Because if we think about doing something like taking a backup, right, that's generating really, really vast amounts of storage. And so if we're not doing it efficiently, can lead to really, really large cost overruns. When we talk about operations in cloud backup, there's a lot of manual, error-prone kind of configuration operations that are required to get a backup solution implemented for an enterprise that has a lot of data in the cloud. And that can lead to, right, missed workloads, compliance gaps, and added risk from a compliance perspective for a large enterprise. Also, we see that restores are slow and risky. What we mean by that is restoration of cloud workloads. If we're thinking about, bringing an instance back from a snapshot, that can take a long time, right? If that has lots of volumes or lots of disks that are large in size, and depending on the size and shape of the data involved, right, certain restore operations can take several hours and even several days, right, in some cases. And finally, we've found, right, that a lot of cloud backup solutions have inadequate ransomware protection. And that includes both the way that backups are stored and thought about, right? So meaning potentially, right, a backups being in the same location as source data, where they're in the same blast radius of the things we're protecting them from, as well as a lack of detection, right? So not being aware that your backups might already be compromised. And then if there's a delayed understanding of a data loss event or a breach or a ransomware attack, you might not even realize that the backups you have, right, are not actually available to be restored and ensure business continuity. So these are all things that we've been seeing across our customers in the cloud. And one of the things that at Eon that we're trying to do is make sure, right, that our backup solution is designed from the ground up to address these pain points in the cloud specifically. And so what we mean by that is we're not kind of taking an existing technology that was designed to be run perhaps somewhere else and then trying to shoehorn it into a cloud context. We've actually taken all of these challenges into account from the beginning in designing our solution. And that's how we built Eon. Right. So Eon is a cloud backup posture management platform. And what we do is we transform backups into usable strategic assets for your company. So let's take a little bit of a look at how Eon works and how Eon actually solves these problems for enterprises that are running in the cloud and particularly in Azure. So with Eon, we actually enable live data access to your backups, right? So those backups that are sitting on the shelf are no longer just something that you kind of think are going to be available one day or hope maybe that are going to be available one day if you need them, but you can actually query those as live data sources. And so you can do that for things like discovery or audits or, right, just let's say moving data around from, different environments or, right, you can enable AI use cases by leveraging data that's in your backups without the need to connect to production workloads. It can also help realize cloud, total cost of ownership reduction. So just like we talked about, by designing a solution from the ground up to efficiently store backups, we're helping our customers see enormous reduction in the actual footprint of their backups, as well as the cost of that backup storage. And then, right, saving time and saving resources, actually implementing governance and compliance around data protection and making sure that your backup posture is always in sync. And we'll see a little bit more about how we do that. And then finally, right, a full ransomware resilience package that includes both the way that backups are stored, meaning air-gapped and immutable, as well as that advanced threat detection that goes down to the file level. And so we'll see more information about all of these when we look at the demo of Eon. And I think the really important thing to keep in mind is all of this comes with a completely cloud native implementation. So what I mean by that is there's no appliances to be installed. There's no agents to be installed. Actually, we don't even require you to, maintain an extra copy of the data in the source account. So everything is a completely managed solution. And we'll look at how Eon actually accomplishes that in a SaaS fashion in your Azure environment. So let's take a little look at the Eon architecture and how that looks in Azure. So from the beginning, right, what we'll notice is this solution being completely cloud native is designed with security in mind. And so we're implementing, of course, platform encryption right at all points in the chain, meaning both when data is being processed, so in flight, and then as well as when it is being stored in the logically air-gapped vault. You might notice that the central part is the Eon, right, managed solution, and that includes Azure subscriptions, where the focus of those Azure subscriptions is processing data. That's a single tenant environment that's provisioned for each Eon customer, as well as Vault subscriptions, right? So a single tenant Azure subscription where a single customer's data is actually, their snapshots are actually stored in a logically air-gapped vault, where all snapshots are completely immutable. And they're, of course, like we said, they're outside of the blast radius of the thing that we're actually protecting them against. So it's really, really critical when we think about a data protection solution. So Eon snapshots, let's talk about what that means, right? Because they're not the traditional cloud snapshot that we might think about. So Eon is, of course, taking these resources, right? All kinds of resources across Azure and other clouds, right? If you might have other hyperscalers, and we're actually processing that data into what we call the Eon storage tier. And so the Eon storage tier is actually designed from the ground up, again, to store data more efficiently and securely for the purpose of backup, but it's also designed to make backup data queryable. And so what we mean by that is backup data, right, is actually stored in a way where it does not need to be restored as a cloud resource in order to be accessed. And what that means is, right, obviously storing it in Parquet format in Blob Storage in the case of Azure, it's queryable using big data tools, right? So whether those are analytics tools in Azure or in another cloud, or even something that's a homegrown solution, right? Anything that can query Parquet files in object storage is actually able to query Eon backups. And so that's really something that's extremely important when it comes to being able to actually use those backups should you choose to, right? So of course, everything, all the capabilities that we're looking at are subject to role-based access control and whether or not you want to enable them within your organization and for whom you want to enable those. But that's something that we're enabling for the first time for all backed up data. So let's take a look at an actual demo and see how that works. So the first thing when we actually go into a demo of Eon that we see is the Eon inventory page. And so the Eon inventory page is really, right, when we see, you might notice Azure resources, a couple Google Cloud and AWS resources. We talk about a completely cloud native implementation for each cloud. So there's only one console, right? If you happen to have Azure plus another, and all of your resources are continuously discovered across your entire cloud environment. And this inventory is going to stay populated and in sync, no matter which subscription the resource comes from, no matter which region it comes from. You can filter that and you can, cut across resources by tags, by other metadata that exists in the cloud. And so it gives you a really, really, really powerful single pane of glass view into all your persistent data in the cloud. And so that's something that's critically important when we think about being able to actually make sure that the things that should be backed up are getting backed up and the things that shouldn't are not unnecessarily being backed up. Now, the other thing that we do is content-based data classification. So we actually go and while we're discovering these resources, we can tell you things like, is there sensitive data on that resource? What environment is that resource, part of? And even what application might be running on that resource? And that's really important, right? Because when we think about that, we're enabling you to get that information, that context for your data protection strategy, even if those resources have not even been tagged. So think about, right? And imagine if you've migrated thousands of resources from a data center and you might not have that context or have that tagging. Well, with Eon, you don't have to, right? You can still create backup policies based on it. So let's look at that, right? With Eon, backup policies are actually defined from a centralized location. They can be delegated, the ability to create policies to individual teams, and there's a number of ways that we can achieve that. But if you wanted to, right, you can define based on tags, based on metadata from the cloud provider, or even based on things like our environment, app, or data classification, or any combination. And then actually determining where the backups are stored and for how long they're stored is as simple as configuring your backup policy and your backup schedules. So it's really, really powerful, right? When you can define backup policies that actually mirror your organizational compliance requirements. And then, right, as we see in the inventory here, these resources that fit those criteria are now considered protected, right? So these resources have had that Eon backup policy attached to it, and they are now being backed up, right? So if I actually go into my Eon dashboard and I look at my drift protection, I can actually understand from my drift protection screen, right? Okay, these resources have been attached to these policies, and I know that they're good to go. So we've talked about, right, how we actually discover resources, how we find them. What can we do with these backups, right? So if I take, for example, a virtual machine, the traditional type of restoration that you might be used to, right? Of course, that's possible to do with Eon. We make it really easy to do, right? So you can do it either a specific disk or the full instance, and you can restore it across regions, across subscriptions, and you can do that either in our console interface or via REST API or via Terraform, right? So there's a number of ways to perform a full instance restore, and it's a really nice and performant way to do so. But we can actually go beyond that, of course, right? So one thing to keep in mind, if we're talking about better ways or more efficient ways to actually access your data, right? So you might have noticed with the data classification that I actually have here evidence, right? So this is, for example, this report has a credit card number. Well, what if I wanted to find, a file called report, an Excel file called report? I could actually search right here, and then actually see from across all of my backups. This search is globally giving me results. So also from block storage, also from object storage. And here it is, right? I'm actually able to find this particular file, and I can see all the points in time for which I have snapshots of that file. So if I want to, right, I can go ahead and granularly recover this file for any point in time for which there's a snapshot of the resource. In order to do this, I don't have to restore the full resource, right? So I can query this, I can bring back this file directly from the backup, the Eon storage tier. And so what that means is, let's say this server, right, this Azure VM that this disk is a part of is 10 terabytes, right, in size, and it would have taken several hours to restore. Well, here I can restore this file to a sandbox environment in the matter of minutes, and I never had to touch, right, anything. This is, of course, included out of the box with Eon. So all file-based resources, right, you don't have to configure indexing, you don't have to pay for searches, it just works. So what about databases, right? So let's look at this, right? If I want to search for a table, let's say I want a claims table, right? From if I'm an insurance company. So I can actually click search here. And now I'm seeing from all of my metadata, right? So my SQL database metadata, in this case, a MySQL database on Azure, I can actually go and explore the database. And so like we saw before, in this case, I'm choosing a particular snapshot for this resource, right, which is an Azure VM with a MySQL database on it. And I can actually run a query, which again, right, this query is not running directly against the a SQL database, right? This is actually running directly against Parquet files in the Eon storage tier. So what this enables me to do, this workflow is I could actually go ahead and restore data without the need to recover the database. And so in this case, right, this is a granular restoration example. But if we think about this, right, there's a number of use cases from analytics to AI enablement, for example, MCPs, to even things like audit and discovery that you can use this feature set for, right? So really, really important to understand. Um, the next thing that I want to kind of show you is what about ransomware, right? So if we think about that, how is Eon doing ransomware differently? So you've seen all the ways that we kind of handle granularity when it comes to files in Eon. Well, one of the things that's really important about ransomware, right? Obviously, we store all backups in a logically air-gapped environment by default, and that's included out of the box, and all backups are immutable by default. But what if we had a ransomware attack, right, in our resources, right, in our source subscriptions, let's say in an Azure environment? Well, what about the backups, right? Today, would you know if you had backups that were infected, or would you have any way to determine that, right? So let's say if you're trying to recover from a ransomware event, how would you be sure that the files that you're looking for are actually going to be there in those backups? So the nice thing about Eon is we do ransomware detection down to the resource level, right? So particular instances, you can go and understand if they've been infected or not. You can look at a dashboard that tells you across your whole environment. But let's look into, a particular instance, right? So let's say this Azure virtual machine. So if I look at this, I can go ahead and look at my snapshots, for example, and see, right, when is the last clean version of the resource, and I can recover that full resource, which is great, and it's a really important capability. But what if I wanted to actually go ahead and look for a particular file that I need that I know was impacted or I want to see was impacted in this ransomware attack? So let's say this contracts document. Right, so this contracts document, there's evidence that it was had suspicious entropy from one backup to the next. And I can see here when is the actual last clean version of this particular file. And that's extremely important, right? So these annotations are helping me understand where I can quickly recover in a very, very exact, right, a surgical way. And I know that my recovery is going to take minutes, not hours or days, and not bring back the potential liabilities of restoring, let's say, a virtual machine that might still have ransomware on it, right? So I'm making sure that I'm getting to the data I need quickly and ensuring business continuity. So this is a little bit about how Eon is helping you improve not just that ransomware protection, right, by storing immutable backups in a logically air-gapped vault environment, but we're also helping you make sure that you're going to have that capability to recover and do it in a really, really efficient way and a really, impactful way to make sure that you can get on with business. So that's it for today. Really appreciate your time, and please let me know if you have any questions. And yeah, this was really nice to talk to you. Have a good one.